here we are. Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going to be discussing the topic from this week's parsha of Beha'alotcha. So I'm going to share the screen with you so you could see the Chumash right in front of you. Okay. So you see here it says, we're talking about the story of Miriam when she got punished for speaking Lashon Hara against Moses. So it says in the verse, chapter 12, Vatraber Miriam ve'Aaron Moshe. Miriam spoke out to Aharon, to her brother, against her younger brother Moses. Alodot ha'isha kushit asher lakach, ki isha kushit lakach. So basically she heard, as Rashi explains, she heard through the grapevine, so to speak, that Moses had separated from his wife. And being the older sister that she was, she's like, how dare he separate from his wife? She didn't realize that God gave a direct order to separate. So without getting into all the details, Moses' reaction was he just was quiet. Va'ish Moshe anav me'od, the Torah testifies he was humble. I don't want to get into all that now. Maybe we'll give another class on humility of Moses. But the punishment was, as you see over here in the text in front of you, Moses prayed for her, but here it is. Yeah. Verse number 14. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe. God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Ve'avia yarok alot tikalem shivat yamim, tisager shivat yamim michutz lamachane ve'achar tasef. Miriam's punishment was she shall be confined for 7 days outside the camp, and only afterwards she may enter. In other words, Miriam received the punishment of leprosy, which was for speaking Lashon Hara, and because she spoke leprosy, she now has to be quarantined in solitary confinement outside the camp for 7 days. Now, it says in verse 15, Vatisager Miriam mechutz lamachane shivat yamim. So Miriam was actually confined outside the camp for 7 days. Beha'am lo nasa ad hasef Miriam. The nation didn't travel, they didn't move anywhere until Miriam had re-entered the camp. Rashi, which you see in front of you, explains, Veha'am lo nasa, the nation never traveled. Rashi says, Ze hakavod chalak lahamakom. This was the honor given to Miriam from God, bishvil sha'a achat, because of 1 hour, shenit'akava leMoshe kshu layor, because there was 1 hour where Miriam, so to speak, waited outside the Nile River when Moses was a baby. Therefore, now the whole country, the whole Israel, 3 million people waited for her. The question is on Rashi, a brilliant question, which the Rebbe asks. He says, I don't understand. Miriam at this stage was 87 years old. So you want to tell me that we would take an 87-year-old lady and we would leave her outside the camp without any provisions and we would just leave? What kind of honor is this giving her? Like, what was the choice? What was the choice? To leave, abandon her? She's in the desert. The desert has snakes, scorpions, no water, no food. So what? It's an honor? What do you mean? She's going to die if you leave her. I understand she has to be quarantined outside the camp. That's not a problem. But what kind of honor is it? Like, what did they do different to Miriam? Something doesn't make sense over here. What special honor was accorded to Miriam that she was outside the camp and the whole nation waited for her? If they wouldn't have waited for her, she would die. So the Rebbe gives a beautiful answer. The Rebbe says, Vatisager Miriam michutz lamachane. It says she was confined outside the camp. Their honor bestowed to Miriam here was the following. The camp didn't travel for 7 days. The Jews didn't travel for 7 days. You see, Miriam's quarantine works only when the Jews are as a camp, meaning only when the Jews are not traveling. If the Jews are traveling, then Miriam, her quarantine doesn't start until they are stable, until they are stationary. So the honor accorded to Miriam here was that the nation of Israel didn't travel for 7 days. Meaning they could have, they should have maybe, but they didn't travel because if they would have traveled, they would have prolonged her distress. She would have had sarat, not for 7 days, but for 8 days or 9 days or 10 days or however long they traveled, because the travel time wasn't part of the quarantine. You understand? It's only when the nation is a camp. That's when the quarantine works. But when the nation is not a camp, in other words, the nation is traveling, it doesn't work. And why was she accorded this honor? So let's go back to the story when Miriam was 6 years old and Moses was born, right? So we know the story. Moses is born, his mother places him in the Nile River, and Miriam stands from afar to watch what happens. So if there's soldiers which come, she wouldn't know what to do. But it happened to be the daughter of Pharaoh came, Batya, and Miriam watches carefully how Batya tries to nurse him with Egyptian mothers, and nothing works. So Miriam goes over and suggests that the child be nursed by a Jewish mother, and then she goes to Moses' mother, her mother, and she nurses him. Now, what if Miriam wouldn't have been there? Let's think for a second. What if Miriam would not have been there? What would Batya, the daughter of Pharaoh, think? So she's trying to nurse him, and Moses is refusing to drink. Now, she knew this was a Jewish child. She knew this. So wouldn't it make sense to Batya, to the daughter of Pharaoh, to eventually go over to a Jewish mother and ask that Jewish mother to feed the child? That would make sense. It would make perfect sense. So what did Miriam accomplish? Miriam saved the child an hour or 2 or 3 of hunger. You see, by her being there, by her watching Moses, watching Batya, and by her going over to Batya, the daughter of Pharaoh, and telling her, hey, I think maybe let's feed him with a Jewish mother, she was able to save Moses hunger for 1, 2, 3 hours. And that is why 86 years later, when Miriam is quarantined, God makes sure that the entire 3 million people don't travel during that time to prolong her 1 or 2 or 3 days of suffering with Sarat. So she only had Sarat for exactly 7 days, and after exactly 7 days she was cured, and then the nation traveled again. What a tremendous lesson for us. You see, if we are able to save an individual from a few minutes of pain, from a few minutes of distress, then that's exactly what we need to do. And remember how God rewards us. Midah keneged midah. If we help an individual, God will reward us exactly in the same way, in the same measure, and it could be years later. And I want to just end off this 10-minute power class with a beautiful story of the Rebbe. The story is told about a man called Tzvi Yair, and he had a cousin in South America, a woman who was dating, a girl who was dating somebody, and she fell in love with a guy who was irreligious. So she was religious. She came from a religious or traditional background, and she wanted to marry this irreligious guy. So her entire family was adamantly opposed to this, against. And they said, the guy's not religious. So she says, well, he committed to becoming religious. So let me trust him that he'll be religious. Arguments back and forth. Eventually it was suggested that she go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe in New York, who both parents and daughter respected, and they would listen to the advice the Rebbe would give them. So they went to New York. She traveled. She had a private audience with Tzvi Yair, her cousin, and the Rebbe. The Rebbe listened, and the Rebbe said the following. He said, I understand you want to marry him. I understand that he has committed to being religious, but you should know, how does he know how to be religious if he hasn't been religious? I suggest you wait a few months, let him during these few months live with a religious family, let him wake up in the morning and say the Modani and the Shema, and they put him on tefillin, let him keep Shabbat and kashrut and kosher and the laws, and let him be surrounded by religion for 6 months. If after 6 months he wants to do it, now that he's become familiar with it, I give my full agreement to the match. And the lady was satisfied. She walks out because the Rebbe is now continuing a private conversation with Tzvi Yair. And as she gets up to walk out, the Rebbe says, call her back. Why? You see, it was 3 a.m. The Rebbe had seen many, many people. The Rebbe must have been very, very tired. At 3 a.m. after a full day's work, I mean, you got to be tired. But the Rebbe said, I don't want her to think that we are talking behind her back. So call her back in, let her be present in this conversation, even though it's got nothing to do with her, because I don't want her to maybe think that we are talking behind her back. You see, this was the Rebbe. Always thinking about another person. If I'm thinking about another person's potential distress, let me avoid it. Let me try avoid, even if it's for 1 moment, the person in his mind or her mind is making up that I'm talking about them, and I can take away, alleviate that distress. Let me do it. This was the Rebbe's approach. This was the lesson. This is the lesson from today about Miriam. about Aharon, about the whole nation waiting for her. I hope you all enjoyed. If any questions, please ask away. Otherwise, I'm going to say goodbye. Take care, Howard. Nice to see you, Sharon, Matthew, Reese, and Josh. Thank you for joining us. Thank you all for joining us on Facebook. We are here every single night, 7:30 p.m. Please join us. Have a good night.